And you are welcome along to the special edition of the Thursday Huddle Breakdown. And why do I mention the day? Is because it's Thursday, obviously, when we're recording this. And we're introducing a new show and with a new permanent host for that show. A familiar face now. He's already made one. He's had his virginal appearance on the Huddle Breakdown, but this is his second. And going forward, our friend Martin Murphy will be hosting this new Thursday show, which we'll talk to you guys, everyone, about in more detail as we move forward. But generally speaking, we're going to do more. We get into this grind of the season, 2 games a week, and Champions League, which we'll talk about a little bit. Doing preview shows, review shows, and we're going to expand on this in this show a little bit for super dorks. Get into some real nitty gritty for the power users of spreadsheets. So with that introduction, Martin, welcome. Thank you for joining Laura in being amongst the insane to be willing to agree to work with Alan and I more than once. And I'll hand it over to you to do your job. So that's how you make the big bucks.
Thanks very much, James. Thank you, Alan. Can I just congratulate the Huddle Breakdown on its transfer coup of signing both Laura, that blend of experience through Laura, and, as you say, a virginal presenter such as myself. Very much a project signing, I would suggest, new to the podcast world. And hopefully you can move me on at some point. We can all benefit greatly financially through that, or I'll just disappear into oblivion like so many of our project signings over the years. In terms of our transfer activity, the manager, I won't go into it too much because Laura and yourselves covered this earlier in the week. But the manager made a few comments. There's probably a lot of things going on behind the scenes, a lot of pushing along there. Alan, what's your take on both the transfers that have come in and maybe other players that we've been linked with, especially positions that we've talked about before, we really need to fill?
Yeah, I think listen, we're where are we? 11 o'clock on Saturday. I think the window closes, so we've got another day and a half, let's call it, to get people in. It is. Listen, this polarizes people that I can see. There's people that take a stance like, we're not signing players because Peter Lowell. We're not signing players because of the board. We're not signing players because we don't have an ambition. Blah 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 blah. My view is those perspectives are largely just fucking ridiculous, quite frankly, right? I don't think there's anybody inside Celtic that doesn't share the same ambitions as the supporters to be a successful football club. But what I think that we're seeing is we're seeing the system, as in the organisational system within the club, being stress tested to breaking point, and the lack of that football strategy, that director of football role, the having an experienced head of recruitment, the fact that Brendan Rodgers is having to spend so much of his time involved in this activity, and also executive level, because you know I do wonder. I do wonder if I think Celtic. Let's give a bit of praise. I do think we're generally and have been historically, and Peter Lowell would come into this being very pretty good at selling players,
Yes.
and especially players that we don't want. And even if it's a million, 2 million, 3 million that we get for some of the players that are not wanted anymore, that's generally successful activity. I mean, we're going to get in this transfer window around about £7 million for academy graduates, right? Now that is very successful. That is actually a good model. Whatever, now I'd prefer them to play in the Celtic first team and sell them for 25 million like Tierney, but that is a once in a generation type deal almost. So that is let's give credit there. And I think historically we've been very good at buying players in the sort of 1 to 3 million range, and possibly our negotiating team are very good at securing and dealing with clubs at that level. Where I think the stress testing has illustrated, whether it's bandwidth issues or competency issues or both, I don't know, but our ability to negotiate with multiple clubs for very high value transactions. So this is the sort of 8, 9, 10, 11 plus million. Doesn't seem to have gone well. And even the speed of it. I mean, the Valle deal for Barcelona, right? The kid wanted to come. Barcelona were desperate to get him off the books. They were absolutely desperate because they couldn't register Dani Olmo until they got rid of about 3 or 4 players, right? So they even put a ridiculously low release fee on. This kid's really highly rated, by the way. Valle could prove to be an absolute coup for Celtic. This is a kid that's very well rated, has got some experience playing in Spain, albeit in the sort of second tier, but was part of the Barcelona first team squad, started the season on the bench, and just through their absolute catastrophic financial mismanagement, they've effectively had to bundle him off to Celtic with a ridiculously low release clause in him. So I think that's good in the sense of, that's us taking advantage of a distressed seller. But I mean, Michael Nicholson was supposedly in London on the Monday to finalise that deal, and it gets announced midway through the Wednesday. Now, if that's the pace that we're doing something which all parties want to happen, what chance when you're negotiating, for example, for a Polish player in the US, where the club doesn't have an open transfer window to replace him with, doesn't need to sell him anyway, and and we just can't get the thing happening. The Engels thing's been going on forever and ever. Other players that have been linked with it's been going on forever and ever. So I don't buy any of the sort of board interference, law, all that, because that's just basically people displacing their dissonance onto as a reason why Celtic aren't successful. I think it's more of an internal competency and bandwidth. I don't think we've got the bandwidth to be dealing with all these deals that we're going for. And my final word from me really is I'm not sure. Do people realise how threadbare we are at the moment? Right? If you consider, I would consider a first team squad to consist of 25 players. Right? 3 of them goalkeepers. We've got the 3 goalkeepers. So let's take that one. So 22 outfield players. Okay. At the moment, if you assume that Nawrocki, dear old Shaw, McCarthy, I'm laughing here, right? Mikey Johnson, Palmer, and Yang. If you assume that they are not part of Brendan Rodgers' first team plans, and I think that's reasonable to assume that, that means we've got 17 players, right? If you then go, well, okay, how many of those 17 players would you be comfortable playing in, let's say, 10 matches in a row in a stretch that could define our season? Let's say a League Cup semi-final, a couple of games in the Champions League, key league matches away at difficult grounds. We're going to have runs like that during the season, right? How many of those 17 players would you be happy seeing playing consistently in that? And I reckon you're probably, of that 17, you've probably got 12. I would say that the likes of probably Ralston, Welsh, James Forrest, who can probably only last 50, 60 minutes, Home, who's still developing, and Valle, who's just a kid, right? Probably aren't in that category for me. So for me, we've got 12 players that you could rely on to play all the big matches and a run of matches that would be important to our season. And then what happens if you get an injury, right? So, it is, to me, we are incredibly threadbare. We are incredibly threadbare, and there's not a lot of time left. So
Alan, Dundee
pressure.
United won the league in 1983 with 14 players, you know.
I know, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant.
James, your opinion, please.
So I'm going to start with the good news, um, which
Good.
is counterintuitive based off of how I usually approach things. Is we spent a lot of money on Engel, which is
Yep,
good in the
yep.
sense that um, we've been so conservatively run. Which again, I have never been critical of that. I've actually been uh, positively oriented in how I think about that. Um, the wage bill sounds like it's getting skewed the way I describe it. Meaning that one of my big criticisms of the club is that we've been running too flat of a wage bill structure. So we've had this bloated squad with a lot of guys in like the bottom half of the wage structure, dead money, I'll call it, kind of dead weight, not really doing that much to contribute on the pitch for the first team. And at the same time, we've kept the high end, let's call it the Callum McGregor level at, you know, 25 to 35 grand a week. If reports are to be believed, again, one never knows, but some of the reports out of the continent are that Angor is going to be on like 48,000 plus a week. plus some incentives. That is a big step for a permanent player. We've paid that kind of money for some very expensive loan players, or at least shared in those kind of wages for very expensive loan players like Shane Duffy and some others. But for us to pay, as reports are, $11 million to pay that kind of wage for Engel, I think it speaks to a shift towards what Brendan Rodgers has talked about, which is a better utilization of resources relative to quality. And how do you do that with a tighter squad and, like I said, skew that wage bill. So that's the good news, is that there's some
Yep.
movement there, and I think it's in the right direction. But that's the key. But change always entails risk, and that's probably where my analytical framework comes in most importantly, is in identifying risk dynamics and risk management. And because contrary to what most people will tell you, the people in the investment world that do well, that's what they're good at. It's anyone can take a lot of risk and make a lot of money, randomness, that kind of stuff. Bull market makes everyone looks like a genius. It's when what hits the fan and things get rough, the people that are able to kind of manage risk that tend to do well longer term. And so the risk I see with this is, number one, we talked about it, you guys have already mentioned, is the structural issues. And it's that infrastructure of the football department, and it's the talent identification. We're buying a mid-table Bundesliga midfielder. What are the chances that that market and that player are dramatically mispriced? Pretty low, right? That's a very well-known, well-covered, well-scouted, high-quality data out the wazoo. Tons of agents and agencies looking at these players. So the idea that we've somehow identified a diamond in the rough, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying from a risk perspective, that's not likely. So the idea that we got some huge deal here on a financial basis, I think I'm skeptical of that. The other thing is that, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, is, maybe he's improved in this regard, but Brendan Rodgers in the past has had some challenges relative to strategically recruiting players that make sense relative to squad needs. That's a risk I see with Engel based off of I'm not saying it's true. Again, risk is about what could happen that would go bad, right? So we can't see the future. No one knows the future. So with that, that's the caveat. But I think that Engel is a high risk signing, not only because of the amount of money, that this is a cultural stretch for the board and for the club. They're getting kind of pushed uncomfortably into doing this, maybe from Rodgers' perspective, as much as we welcome this. And I just went over why that's the case. He's on huge wages for the club, right? So in an ideal world, that would be a layup signing. That would be someone that looks like Matt O'Reilly when Alan and I looked at him when we signed him and said, holy crap, this guy looks robust. He looks good across the board. Yeah, he's not fast, but pretty much everything else, it's like, wow. Like Alan and I were having wet dreams about Matt O'Reilly as soon as we signed him, right? So that's not Engel. Engel does not display that kind of like, wow. He doesn't jump off of the page. And again, I'm not saying he's going to be unsuccessful. He's clearly a good player. He's playing in the Bundesliga. It's a question of that fit. Alan talked about that on Tuesday, how good players, if they're not put in the right roles, in the right context, doesn't turn them into bad players. You just don't get as much out of them as you otherwise might. And I think Ida is also a high risk signing to a degree in that regard. Price tag, role he's going to be asked to play, and how he fits, particularly if if we get some bad news in the next 48 hours, theoretically, if Kyogo were not to be around, then all of a sudden that risk mushrooms, right? That becomes a risk that manifests, because now Ida's the main man, depending on who we scramble to sign at the last second in the striker position. So that's the good news and the bad news. I think our risk levels just went up a lot, and what Alan described relative to the threadbare squad, and this is one of the concepts I always go back to, is that risk dynamics, when you stack them on top of each other, that is not a linear function. That becomes non-linear, right? So we've talked about one of the main risks that Rodgers has as a manager is injuries. So now we've got a threadbare squad with high-priced, high-profile signings that need to work out because we've culturally stretched to do this. They need to be like huge successes for a lot of reasons, not only on the pitch, but like to get buy-in on let's keep this like permanently so we don't regress. Um, with a manager who has a struggling track record with managing injury risk. Um, so that's the downside of this potentially. And again, we can all hope, like we'll get into it in a minute. The risk of a Champions League draw going tits up for us was there. I mean, that we could have had a horrible Champions League draw. There was a risk of that, and that risk wasn't realized. So I think those risk levels are elevated. I think they're significant risks now because of the way things are going. Doesn't mean they're going to really be realized. We could still go on to win a treble, and we'll get into this briefly on the Champions League. We could get out of the Champions League group. That all is well within the span of an outcome probability distribution, and I think it's reasonable that could happen. But this could also go bad and pretty bad if we have a rash of some injuries like we did last season, and Engel doesn't adjust well and maybe doesn't live up to his obvious billing that's going to be there. I mean, this guy's going to come in with a lot of pressure now because of this. He's replacing Matt O'Reilly. That's not fair. He's not Matt O'Reilly, but that's going to be because of the price tag. He's going to get labeled that by a decent amount of the support. Fair or not, that's the reality. That's life. Welcome to the real world, kid. And so he's going to have to hit the ground running. And, for a guy who maybe doesn't perfectly fit the way we play, there might be some growing pains and some adjustments. So that's my my elevator speech, bloviating elevator speech on the dynamics that we're facing.
And I think you're right, James. It's going to be the kind of litmus test, I think, for Rodgers now. He's nailed his colours to the mast. He's said this is the way that we need to go. If these guys work out fantastic, I'm sure there will be more of them. If they don't, there'll be questions asked, and it'll be on Brendan with this, really, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, shall we move on to the Champions League?
Absolutely.
Because as we were recording these segments today, we all got to be bored to death. Even more bored to death than our show is watching these yahoos that host these Champions League programs. I mean, I can't believe these people keep getting rehired. It's brutal watching these shows. So I actually usually just put it on mute and wait for the freaking balls to drop. Although this year's was actually better with this Irish Catholic AI that got programmed. I don't know with the draw that came out, but I did enjoy the filling in of the games was a lot faster, so that was good. But yeah, so let's talk about it. Alan, you've got the ditty. You know all the facts. So who are we?
Yes.
Who are we playing? Where are we going? What the hell's going on here?
I think everyone probably who's watching this, due to the wonders of social media, will know what the draw is. But looking at it, if you said, let's say, just for the sake of argument, we were in groups of 5 for the Champions League. If we were in a Champions League group with Aston Villa, Borussia Dortmund, Atalanta, let's say, a traditional 4-team Champions League group, we'd be pretty happy with that. I mean, I'm not saying we'd win many games. I'm just saying it could have been a lot worse, right? And similarly, if we were in a Europa League group with Bruges, Young Boys, Dynamo Zagreb, and Slovan Bratislava, we'd be like, we've got a chance of getting out of that group. So all things considered, it's probably as favourable a draw as it could have been. Again, I'm not saying we're going to win all the games. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm saying it could have been a hell of a lot worse. And actually, it's all in front of this team. They've got Slovan Bratislava, Young Boys, Bruges, and Leipzig at home. Now, again, that's that in the past. That's been a Europa League level,
Yep.
set of fixtures, right? And they're all at home. So they've got a fighting chance. I mean, I think Atalanta away, Europa League champions, that's going to be really tough. Borussia Dortmund, last season's Champions League runners-up away. That's going to be really tough. Aston Villa under, they've got a really slick team at the moment. That's going to be really tough as well. But I think the other games, you've got to be thinking to try and pick up some points, even if it's a draw or whatever. And all of them has got to be the objective, really. And as I say, I don't think it could have. It's all there. It's all in front of them. There is a chance, as you say, you've got to finish in the top 24 out of 36. There is a chance to do that. I think it's a
I
really interesting format. Actually,
Yeah.
I'm as cynical as anyone else about UEFA, their motives, and this further step towards a Super League in a sense. Um, However, it is actually quite an interesting concept the way that this draw panned out. There is actually jeopardy for some of the big teams, you know, and so I think it's all good. I think it's exciting. 8 different opponents, that's great. It'll give us more to look at, more databases to inquire against. We'll try and hunt down some friendly analytics folk from some of those clubs as well to come on maybe. So yeah, all good, very exciting.
well, I'm going to be a little more aggressive in my view on it. Is that there's no excuses now. Like this is it. This is again when I go back to the stacking of risks. You could have a plausible explain away had we got Man City and PSG and Leverkusen
Juventus
and
and Leverkusen, yeah.
Arsenal. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, we talked about risk. Like this could have been a brutal day from um, a pot and games fixture list perspective. This is about as easy as it gets, and that doesn't mean it's easy. Like there's relative and absolute. I mean, I actually I was going to do a tweet on it yesterday. Now I should have, but I was like, I'm not going to bother with it. But pretty much the only team out of my preferred list that didn't get picked was Aston Villa. I mean, that's a rough pot 4 team, like objectively. But outside of that, I mean, you could maybe swap out Shakhtar for Atalanta. Again, not to say that they're going to be easy, but relative to Leverkusen or Arsenal, or it's the same with, I mean, Dortmund and Leipzig are legit like third and fourth, maybe in Germany now because of how good Leverkusen is right now. I mean, I'm not saying Leverkusen's going to be like that forever. Um, so pot one, third and fourth best teams in Germany, like that's not that bad. The third and fourth best teams in France are in pot 4 and 3. So, it's I think it's and I said the same thing going into the last season's champions. We got a really friendly draw last season. This
Yeah.
one is as well. And, that was no excuses. There were, injuries, blah, blah, blah. Well, cry me a river. That's true, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. And now it's like we should get out of this group. No
Yeah.
excuses.
I,
Now I'm
I,
not saying we get out. I'm not saying we get through to the knockout stage and the knockout stage relative to the last 16, but we should get out into that 24 team group. There's no excuse for us not getting at least 7 points at home. Like that to me would be a minimum given the team. And that's not to, talk crap about Young Boys or Bratislava, but they are teams with equal or actually less resources than we have. Club
yeah.
Bruges, similar. Like they are a peer group for us, locked in as far as how much money they can spend on
Mhm.
players and their financial resources.
They signed Jack
Um,
Hendry at one point, didn't they?
I think they did. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that from Ostend, I think from Ostend.
Yes,
so did
that's
we.
correct.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Don't think I didn't didn't remember.
So yeah, I think it's again great. It's kind of like what I said in the first part about recruitment. Great news. There's elements of this that are terrific, but if this doesn't go well, I mean, there's no given Rodgers' track record in the Champions League, given the last 20 years of our experience in Europe, this is it, man. It's like put up or shut up because we're never going to get a better draw than this. I mean, it would be hard to imagine unless the Irish conspiracy continues for a third year next year and we somehow qualify. It's not happening. So great news. I'm thrilled. I love the lineup. I think these are going to be fun games. They're going to, we're not going to be pinned in. You know what I mean? Like these aren't going to
Yeah.
be defending the 18-yard box for 80 minutes and pray to God you don't get crushed 5-0 or worse. we should actually, even in the tougher games like at Dortmund, I mean, we should have a puncher's chance to get a draw, that kind of situation. Like it's so I'm ecstatic. I think it's great.
It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that we hammered Manchester City and Chelsea in pre-season, but
First time ever.
we're up for it. Just to end on that, really, it'll be very interesting to see how Brendan approaches this. Will he still have a naivety about the way he sets up in these European games, especially away from home? Will he have learned, and can we actually get a result or two away? Because I think that'll be absolutely make or break for us.
Let's hope so. So well, that's I think there's something coming up this weekend that's not related to transfer market and
Oasis
Champions
have
League.
reformed,
Is
James,
that what it
and
is? Yeah, it's
yes,
been a
yes,
busy
there's
week.
a huge ticket sale on Saturday morning. So yeah, worth
You'll be
keeping that in mind. Yeah, oh, I'm mad for it.
well. Well, remember in our day, you had to camp out for those kind of tickets instead of sitting like a speed fiend on your computer hitting refresh uh, with your
Yeah,
methamphetamine getting you going to get your ticket in. But yeah, so you won't be camping out, Martin. No, actually, what we're talking about is the Glasgow Derby Sunday, and we have a special treat. Part of what we're looking to do with this new Thursday show is to incorporate some outsiders, some people who root for other teams, if you can believe the audacity of that. And can you believe that we secured some maniac that's willing to come onto this podcast and talk about Rangers as a Rangers supporter? So you're about to meet him. His name is Patrick Caskie. For those of you who may have seen him on Twitter, he's although he told us after we got done recording, he's in retirement now on Twitter for the most part, but he still puts out some content on Twitter. So yeah, we're really pleased and thrilled that he was willing to do this. Hopefully it goes okay for him and he doesn't get too much abuse from our supporters, our viewers, or his own supporters. So yeah, we're going to head into the segment with Patrick.
we're joined today also by Patrick Caskie, who's a Rangers fan and another devotee of data and analysis. So with the events coming up at the weekend, out with the Oasis ticket sale, people will be looking forward to the Glasgow Derby, and very much looking forward to hearing from the other side of the hill and Patrick's views on Rangers. So welcome, Patrick. Great to see you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me.
So I'm going to jump in here because I'm super excited to have this happen. Not only because, first of all, formally welcome, Patrick, and thank you for having the courage to join us on this show, because we certainly appreciate the sensitivities that can accompany these kind of conversations. So our goal is to try to keep this as objective and analytical as possible, and so we really appreciate you joining us. So a lot of our viewers probably don't follow Rangers as closely. I know as I do because I kind of analyze Rangers consistently and watch all the games. But obviously you have a different perspective. You're going to follow it much closer than any of us three. So how are you feeling as far as where Rangers are in this transition phase from, the rebuild, Clement putting his footprint on the team, and kind of the summer preparation for going into the post-window period here?
Yeah, I mean, safe to say, not very bullish on it. I don't think we're in the period or position in which it's quite as bad as it was in, let's say, 2016-17 coming up against Celtic, where it was sort of preordained to be 5 or 6-0. Here, I think there's certainly the possibility that we could see a formula similar to the 2 GVB at Celtic Park Old Firms, which was 4-0 and 4-0, and probably the poorest part of his reign individually and collectively. There is some ability to be optimistic in a case that there are still some decent players. I don't know if man-to-man comparison relative to the final form of last year, if we're stronger, but I certainly prefer the position we're in, albeit it's not a great one, but we did shed a lot of wages. Incomings, albeit inconsistent, have some coherence in sort of the age profile. proper the obvious outlier there, but then there was some sort of smart financial stuff within that deal, apparently, contract expiring or release clause expiring a day, and we got him a lot less than market price. And then tactically, I think post Gerrard, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of the approach. It hasn't been as coherent, obviously, between three managers since then, but none of them have been able to provide a sort of answer. Obviously, the football Celtic were playing with Ange was great, and even a top manager would have a hard time dealing with that and nullifying it, let alone dominating that. Whereas now, I would perhaps say I'm more confident in terms of the 11v11 in tactical battle than if it was last year or 2 years ago rather. But it does certainly seem, at least from the outside, the Celtic are playing a lot better now, more coherent, more aggressive, more rotations than it would have been when we played them in April.
Yeah. So Patrick, what I'm interested in, I guess, we're nearly a year into Clement's reign now. How would you characterise his style of play and what he's trying to do, and what do you think that he will do to try and find weaknesses in the Celtic team?
So I think there's often a slight made at managers for Rangers and Celtic that they lack a style, but I do think the stylistic clustering in football is really difficult because 90% of managers, and very good ones, play a style which is quite hard to discern. It's only when you see major tactical tweaks which can then revolutionize the way football is played in a certain country. You can see with Pep Guardiola in England, or with Ange and his inverted fullbacks in Scotland, which wasn't really a thing before him, and he's obviously it's changed the approach. And I think perhaps the better way to look at Clement's football is when we play teams who are equally as good as us. So let's look at the sample size in the Europa League. Because when we play in Scotland, all but the games against Celtic and then perhaps the away games at Hearts, Hibs and Aberdeen, it's very difficult to discern a style outside of having a lot of possession. You can play really well and still end up looking like a horseshoe, which was a big discernible downside to Van Bronckhorst football, but also generally bad high possession football. But I think if we're going to look at it within a positive mindset, it's slightly more direct. If you were to look at teams who are sort of similar level to Rangers and Celtic using ELO data, and look at teams who are title challenging, Rangers cluster, or they actually come out really, really high or low, depending on how you look at it, for passes per attack and passes per shot, indicating a more direct approach, whether that be because we have a lot of long shots and it's a sort of misguided attempt, because you can see someone like Tom Lawrence is picked, I think, basically on the hope that he'll take a shot once and it'll go in. I mean, that's basically the only evidence, because if there's a lot of shortcomings with his game, at least, and I think that will be exposed at Celtic, the lack of mobility at the number 10 to sort of do any pressing on a 6, unless you play Diamande up there. But I think it's more direct. Interestingly, we've seen a bit more inversion, but only from Tavernier at right back. I think that has to do with some physical ailments and him aging. He is superhuman physically, but it seems to be catching up with him. He's played, I think, only Kasper Schmeichel in the Scottish Premiership has played more minutes than him, and that's with Callum McGregor, who is equally superhuman and plays international football. But I do think it'll be sort of inside wingers. Czerny might have a big impact on the game just because he is the sort of profile, the dual threat who can carry, create, ball strikes well, in which a game in which we don't have as much possession, the movements are less clear, and it's a bit of fighting off scraps, which I think it realistically will be. It'll be down to individual talent as opposed to a coherent game plan. Okay. But if there is a successful coherent game plan, I think it will be to go as vertical and as direct as possible. Ideally, you would probably see it as circumventing the midfield and hitting Dessers quickly. He struggled against some teams to hold the ball up, especially Carter Vickers, but he was quite good in the last few games, Kiev aside, and then letting the wingers, whether it be Matondo's pace or Czerny's guile and ability to take over. That is a game plan which is, I don't think, on the margins going to happen, but I think it is probably the best chance of what we're going to see.
Okay.
So if I could segue off, sorry, Alan, if I could segue off of that, because and it directly relates to your comment, is one of the observations I've made in this season to date is that the directness is manifesting more through ground passes from deep, meaning that I think that's been the main shift that I've seen, is that with Diamande and Barron primarily playing those deep midfield roles, that they're playing more of those line splitting on the ground, hitting Dessers to hold up play and play out, but not the high balls that a Goldson would play, for example. Is that a feeling I'm having, or is that actually something that you've picked up as well?
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, certainly I haven't looked into it per se. But anecdotally, you can see someone like Barron really likes to punch his passes and play them on the ground. And we are, I would say, distancing the lines between the pivot and the 10. That is probably to get Lawrence as high as possible again, because he is a good footballer in the final third. There are lots of shortcomings outside of that there. But he is good there. He can strike the ball well, find some players. Also, the loss of Goldson, who, despite the downturn in form, perennially offered a good long ball. Two wingers, and with Sima, who offered the height and the strength to sort of dominate what we would have seen like with Greg Taylor last year. Fairly early, we did the sort of what the rest of the league do to Celtic, and we put a man on Greg Taylor and played it high, which makes sense because there's a massive physical mismatch there, and Sima is was one of the better players. But I think personnel-wise, it might have forced Clement's hand. But I do think while playing on the ground, it's a better environment and ecosystem for coherent football, just because you're going to be able to receive it. Obviously, there'll be pressure, no more so than in Old Firm. But the ideal scenario when we were playing long diagonals was he takes it down and he isolates 1v1. And when we had profiles like Kent, who was good, shifting his way, attacking, obviously when he got into the box, it was a bit of a struggle. And then with Sima, who's the opposite, more direct and then very effective in the box, it was playing on the ability for those guys to win their one-on-one duels. Whereas now it's slightly more coherent given the fact that you're playing on the ground and you hope to provide bodies there. But I do think, obviously, going to Celtic Park, we won't dominate possession as we would in other games. So we might see a reversion to sort of the longer balls, because it is always the elephant in the room is Greg Taylor's physical ability. And I'm not too familiar with the Alex Valla guy who Celtic just signed, but I'd be very surprised, regardless of how he plays or his form, that he would be thrown in the first game.
Yeah. I think
I guess, Patrick, one of the things. Sorry, I was just going to say. I guess one of the things that strikes me. You look at Rangers in Europe over the last few seasons, and they've really done very well, I think, and some would say punched above their weight in terms of Scottish football. They played quite a low block, used players like Tavernier, to be a creative force and so forth. And snatch goals, whether it be, in the past it was people like Morelos and so forth. Yeah, I think there's sometimes that pressure when they come to Celtic Park to maybe play maybe a higher press, maybe a more aggressive game, because we're seen to be perhaps more equal as a Glasgow derby. There's a lot at stake there. How do you think that Clermont will approach the game in that sense? Do you think it will be the low block, more kind of almost European style, and try and snatch a result, or do you think he'll try and pressurise the Celtic midfield and defence?
So I think it is an interesting question. I think quite possibly the worst outcome for Clermont is playing on the backwards foot and still getting trounced or even losing, just because there are question marks around the fact that he's yet to win one. And if he was to go to Celtic Park, and I would obviously take a draw before the game was played, but if he was to do so on the basis of playing for the draw and then you lose, I think that's much worse than going out and playing on its merit or going for the win. As a fan and also as someone who wants the football to be played that way, I think team selection is quite obvious. There is lots of rumors as to transfer window incomings in the last few days, albeit regardless of how good they are, they're not going to be thrown in Celtic Park the first game, I don't expect. I would assume that we're going to play sort of like Butland and Tavernier, Suter, Proper, and probably Jeft at left back because Yilmaz is injured, Baron Diomande, and then Cherny, Lawrence, probably Matondo. That could be a question as to who's going to play on the left wing. You could see McCausland, I doubt it, or on play on the right. And then Destra's up top. I do think the importance and the target will constantly be Destra's.
Yeah.
His ability to hold up at times is quite good, especially when it's played to feet more so when he's in the air, because despite being all of 186 centimeters, which is a decent height, he's not the most effective in the air, and his upper body strength isn't amazing, whereas his sort of more lower body and ability to play off is probably his best thing or his most consistent, because he is very, very inconsistent in front of goal. Despite striking it quite well, his accuracy and finishing is at times looks great. The goal he scored on the weekend was fantastic, but then other times he has a reputation which perceives himself, which makes sense. But I also do think it will be reactive. Not to say that necessarily means it'll be defensive, but I do think it'll be reactive as to the game plan that Celtic play. because whether we like it or not, they're going to be the ones in the most likely defining how the game is played. And if we can do so by taking advantage of perhaps poor build-up, confusion in the midfield without O'Reilly, because he's been fantastic against Rangers in the last few games, albeit it will still be a settled midfield three you'd expect with Bernardo, McGregor and Hatate, who can all equally provide their own threat. And Bernardo has a goal to his name against us, so he'll come in with confidence. But I would say that there is, if you're asking anyone to bet on how it's going to be played, I think it would be a losing bet. But I do think we can bet on the directness and perhaps physical overloading. Someone like Taylor, maybe someone like McGregor and Hatate, despite the fact that they have like incredible lungs and can run for the entire game despite age and injury.
So I think that is an interesting
Thank you.
conundrum, because I take your point that from a fan perspective, from a perception perspective, to go to Celtic Park and to sit in and then lose the game would probably play badly with your support. I get that, but I do wonder, because I actually hope that Rangers press Celtic high. I really do. That's what because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but of the forward players you mentioned, would I be right in thinking that perhaps McCausland's the best off the ball of all of those four potential front players? I'm not sure that Dessers has got. I mean, he's not that rapid across the ground in terms of pressing. Matondo, I don't think, that doesn't strike me as somebody who presses well. I'm not sure about Czerny, because having a Kasper Schmeichel makes a huge difference to Celtic. Our ability to play out from the back and to beat the press has just gone up enormously with him on the park. And the other thing is that we probably won't play a single new signing in the outfield on Sunday. It'll be all players that were there last season, and what we've witnessed in the first 4 games of the season is whilst we have issues with the quality of a lot of those players. And you've mentioned the left-hand side of Celtic's defence, especially. The level of cohesion has just gone up massively, and that is demonstrated in press resistance, but also press effectiveness. So I'm hoping that Clement feels pressured to put to play more aggressively. But other thing I wanted to ask you is, you listed there a potential team. This is slightly non-analytical, but one thing I believe, watching these derby matches over a long period of time, is that, as I mentioned, we won't have anybody that hasn't played in these games before playing on Sunday. You might have quite a few players playing who've never played in a derby match before. I just wondered if you felt that might be influential in the game at all.
Well, I think obviously that impairs, if you haven't, your ability to react to such a high intensity, perhaps hostile environment, obviously without away fans. You would probably look at someone like Barron as perhaps the odd one out, albeit I think the best game certainly that I watched for him at Aberdeen was maybe the Celtic semi-final. I thought he was great in that.
Yeah.
Albeit that is a cup semi-final against Celtic at Hampden. It kind of pales in comparison to what Rangers Celtic game offers. Czerny was at FC Twente and then Ajax, which predates that. But he's played quite consistently for the Czech Republic in Euro competitions. It's a different sort of pressure. It doesn't manifest itself in the same intensity and ferocity in the stadium, which I think probably impairs a player's ability to perform more so than social media pressure or the sort of pressure of the flag or the badge, or not the badge, but the flag rather. But equally, you could say, in a bad scenario, the amount of scar tissue built up within a number of these players in the Rangers team perhaps is even worse than having a cadre of new guys coming in. Because over the last, since Gerrard left, there's been two wins, one win in 90 minutes, and that was one which was, as everyone will say, fairly meaningless. It didn't give Beale much credit at that point. So there is that conundrum, but it's not something we can actually affect change on because the transfer window is done. We can't sort of battle train them in a simulator to do 3 Old Firms at Parkhead, as much as that would probably benefit them. But I do think that is a nuance which might affect. But obviously, we haven't played massive games so far. The Kiev away game was incredibly weird in the sense it was played in Lublin and it was in front of a half-filled stadium. Yeah. And then the Dynamo Kiev game was also in front of a non-packed or atypical Rangers home game at Europe. And it was obviously the vibes of it were quite weird with the second half sending off. So a lot of these team players have been at Rangers, but they played 5 or 6 games, which will give them some experience of playing in front of the crowd. But they've been quite atypical in the sense of the stadium and both home and away.
I think you raised some really interesting points there, Patrick. One thing that really struck me, I go back to a very successful old Rangers manager, Jock Wallace, and he always used to talk about character, the character to play for Rangers, or indeed Celtic. And your captain Tavernier came out a couple of years ago talking about the pressure he felt and others in that particular squad felt, playing at Ibrox in front of a crowd that's very supportive when things are going well, but very quick to let them know when they were unhappy. And I think in this particular match, you'll very quickly find out the players that do have the character, that will stand up to it. I was also kind of, you kind of think about if I were in the Rangers side, how would I do things? And I wondered what your opinion was in terms of Tavernier himself, where he's done Celtic a lot of damage over the years. He's been Rangers' biggest threat in terms of scoring goals, setting up goals, etc. But he's also in many of the matches, apart from things like the free kicks and dead ball situations, been pretty much nullified by Dazen Maeda. And I wondered whether there was the possibility, in your opinion, that Clement might try something a little bit different, maybe between Connor Barron and Tavernier, maybe giving Tavernier a slightly different role, a bit more roving, harder to pick up and create? Or do you think he's much more likely just to think, right, well, let's keep things settled, let's not try anything too dramatic here?
Well, I mean, interestingly, I think using sort of an atypical use of Barron as a sort of false right back in transition scenarios where and in possession is something we've seen quite a lot already. So I would expect him to continue with this because it both allows for the best possible rest defense when playing, because Tavernier, albeit still probably is a good athlete in most circumstances, his pace has been the one thing that's sort of cratered at this point, albeit it's not to the point where it's easily accessible. But with someone like Maeda, anyone who is off of above average pace, it's the thing to be exposed. But I do think we'll see Barron taking what Ryan Jack used to do quite often and sitting in the right back in higher phases, like in the final third, albeit it might be a bit awkward in the sense that Barron is often the first target in build-up. He picks the ball up between the two centre-backs, and he's been quite pivotal in doing that so far. So there might be the confusion in transition scenarios when one guy has to run to the right back, and then Tavernier is asked to fill in somewhere and what that does. But I would expect to see Tavernier involved in everything set piece wise. He still is relative to the metronome of the team. His inversion allows him to open even more angles with that, especially in build-up play. So he's not really a middle and final third dominant player. You're seeing him picking up more so in early build-up phases, which is good because he is one of our technically better players. And I do think, interestingly, the conundrum, obviously Sterling is fit, but I know I wouldn't say a majority, but certainly a quite large minority would probably not want to play Tavernier at Celtic Park. But then if we were to then do that and then lose, there would also be tons of discussion about how do you not play the player who has sort of affected the most change in these recent games, as he has developed a habit of scoring against Celtic in the last few years. And I do again think that set pieces will be probably one of our best avenues to any sort of actual manifestation of chance creation and high quality chances. From a free kick, I don't think there's a better player in Scotland. And I think the evidence sort of shows that. I don't think he's at the level where it's like 1 in 2s going in, because it just doesn't manifest it that way. It's more definitely towards those 1 in 20s, 1 in 25s, but he hasn't scored a free kick in a while. So hopefully that will be the...
So that's bad news for us.
So again, you perfectly segued into what my question was, which was relating to the enigma that is Dujon Sterling. As you know, Patrick, I do these dopey benchmarking exercises, and I even do them for Rangers players, much to the chagrin of both our supporters and your supporters, at least according to what I get on Twitter for doing it. And he benchmarked very well in certain facets of play when I looked at him last summer when you guys acquired him. And there's a concept in baseball. I know you're a basketball fan, but I don't think you're a baseball fan. I don't think you're that crazy. There's a concept in baseball called the super utility player. And some of the most innovative clubs like Tampa and the Dodgers have deployed them very aggressively, meaning that they're above average players at multiple positions. So they're able to be used in that kind of dynamic way. And so I think he's a terrific player. I think he's got a lot of value because of that. But I wonder what your thinking is. I'm not sure. I agree with you. Probably not going to happen, but it's kind of a theoretical case of him supplanting Lawrence in the starting lineup, to try and control midfield, to get more of that physical and pace advantage in midfield, make it more of a battling type of game. And, whether that's a manifestation of Diamande in the 10, or they just, went more of a flat 3 in the midfield. What would your thoughts be in that kind? Because that's what I worry about. I've been worrying about that for obviously before the acquisition of Barron. It had predecessors, but that's the combo I've been worried about seeing, is some mix of Diamande and Sterling in the same midfield.
I don't think it'll happen, just on the insistence that he's had with Lawrence throughout this season and towards the end of last season. He's basically been playing every game. You could maybe say it's at the behest of a lack of options. Dowell's been fit, but it would be something I would definitely, if I was picking the team. Thankfully, I'm not. I would prefer to play Diamande as a 10. I think there's a lot of utility in pushing him a few vertical planes higher, because when he's receiving now, he good on the turn, good at finding angles, playing in wingers, but he's doing it at the halfway line. And that's fine if you're playing against a really high line, which Celtic might use. But I think there's a lot of wasted potential there, playing him so deep, because I do think he can affect the game further forward. We saw his early returns from shooting were fantastic, albeit very outlierish, and that was going to return to the mean, and it did so. Those 2 goals were early, and they didn't pop up again. But I do think Sterling's ability to sort of perhaps not dominate, because no one person can dominate midfield. It's part of a cadre of 3. But I do think he provides an impetus and a tempo setting, perhaps out of possession, that would help. And again, I think perhaps supplanting Barron's role with Sterling playing a sort of false right back in sort of transition scenarios, is perhaps the best thing possible. Because I think if Rangers fans were to tell you what's the perfect right back on the basis of players from the last 5 years, you'd be like, mix Sterling's out of possession and defensive tenacity and physicals with Tavernier's in possession ability. And it's not like a situation where we're carrying, for example, against Kiev, we played Giefta and Ridvan with 2 left backs and had to play one of them as a left winger just to fit him in. It wouldn't be that, because Sterling does play quite naturally as a 6. I think it's his best position, partially because there's no point in thinking about him as a right back whilst Tavernier has a contract, because he's just not going to play. I prefer not to see him as a pressing winger, as we saw a lot towards the end of last season, because albeit it does help when he was on the right pressing Greg Taylor and Liam Scales, I do think the inability for him to trap the ball, play nice passes, and his touch isn't that soft. So it's at a trade-off of any ability in possession, whereas when he's playing as a 6, there's a larger amount of space, so his touches can be a bit larger, his step count can be larger, and it sort of accommodates his physical abilities and technical abilities. Because if you have him roaming around out of possession, attacking pressing triggers, and then in possession playing easy passes off to Diamande, to Barron, to Tavernier, that's probably the best way to isolate him. Albeit you can hope that, and then something random happens, like Lundstrom runs and gets a red card, and then all goes.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I didn't even want to mention his name, because we've made fun of him so much in the past. But we were always pleased to see Mr. Lundstrom's name hit the team sheet. One of Alan and I's favorite over time. So, well, you've been generous with your time, Patrick. We sincerely appreciate you doing this. We hope maybe it's not too poorly received. Hopefully, it's very well received broadly, and we can have you back in the future. And would love to talk to you about all kinds of aspects of Scottish football, not only just Celtic and Rangers in the future. So thank you very much for joining us. Let's plug your Twitter handle. You put up some, you're a fellow dork like us guys. You put up some really cool content throughout the season. So where can people find you on Twitter?
Yeah, it's at Patrick Caskie. So Patrick spelled normally, then Caskie. I am semi-retired for the last 2 seasons because I do work
what
in the football industry. So
you're actually in the industry.
Yes, yeah. So
fancy guy. We didn't even know that. You've been keeping this secret the whole time. What the hell, Patrick?
Yeah, so it's semi-retired, which to many people who are probably listening to that podcast is probably good, because then they don't have to come see a lot of Ranger stuff on their timeline, potentially retweeted by any of you 3 guys. But I'd be happy to come on again, although if Rangers do pull the rabbit out of the hat and do win, it's sincerely a bad omen to have me on.
Appreciate that.
We'll take the risk. We take the risk. Honestly, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Patrick. Thank you. Okay, so a huge thanks to Patrick. And if we can get right into the business at hand now, a Glasgow derby coming up on Sunday. Alan, where is that game going to be won and lost?
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, I think Patrick, first of all, again, he's a great lad. Honestly, follow him on Twitter because he does produce great stuff. And as you can tell from the way he spoke there, he's a very, very balanced, very knowledgeable, very talented young man. So, and he spoke very well. And I think he was, he pointed out some quite insightful aspects of where his team are perhaps, maybe a little bit stronger than I potentially realised. I know that Conor Barron, for example, has settled in well. The fact that he covers for Tavernier, who remains their most dangerous attacking player. I mean, if he was to leave, I know they've sold off nearly all their big earners. He's obviously up there. If he were to leave before the match, I think that would be a tremendous blow for them. He is by miles their most creative player, really. I think, as I said during the game, I'm kind of hoping that Clement feels he is a bullish kind of character. I hope he feels that the need to kind of really go at Celtic a little bit and really press Celtic high. I think the cohesion that Celtic are playing with is probably in stark contrast. I think Patrick answered the question well. My observation with Clement, and I do take Patrick's point, when they're playing at home, playing against the bottom sides, even away to the bottom sides, they will dominate possession. They will play possession football. It won't look that much different to a Celtic game in many respects. But I think when they do play some of the better teams, I think it's a lot more direct. Actually, I think it becomes quite direct, and I'm not sure what their game plan is as such, other than to hit Dessers early sometimes and to get lots of crosses in the box. And I do wonder, what is that identity? And the reason I say that is that not to say that they don't on occasions have that, and I think they probably play better sometimes against better teams. The European results weren't too bad last season. I do come back to the point that Celtic will play 11 players, 10 outfield players on Sunday who all played last season and have been playing under that cohesion. We saw last week at St Mirren, we saw that we had one player, Ida, who just wasn't at the same level of fitness and understanding as the rest of the players, and that really did stand out. And we saw Bernardo, I think, play a pretty uncomplicated game, and he did it very well, and he lasted about 60, 70 minutes. But I think we'll have Kyogo back on Sunday. I think Bernardo will start and probably be that little bit more up to speed. And I think we're just playing with a fitness level and a cohesion that we've taken from pre-season into the season, hit the ground running, use those weak gaps between games to really build on that. And I know it's going to get stressed more than it has done against the teams that we're playing, but I don't think we'll see a team press us as high as we'll see on Sunday. And when you add in the pace of Maeda and Kuhn and Kyogo up front, and you add in the effect that Schmeichel will have on allowing us to beat that press, I'm hoping they come on to us, and I think we're going to get a lot of joy in that regard. I really do. So I'm very optimistic, as I say. I don't, I think there's obviously a lot of things going on there. They're selling off all the best players who are the most expensive, on the highest wages. You can't do that and maintain a cohesive unit. The problem is, as James talked about on Tuesday, from our perspective as an analyst, that 6-0 win against Ross County, it just skews all the data. There's not a lot between the two clubs after 3 games. I mean, 3 games is nothing anyway, and they absolutely padded out the cell, with data on that win. So it kind of skews the reality, I think, which is that Celtic are, I think, going to be a far stronger side. I'm not being blasé about that. It's just genuinely what I feel when I look at the underlying performance data and the cohesion that the teams are playing with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. James, one of the things that I'd like your opinion on really is looking at the starters for Celtic. You've got James Forrest, who be making his 500th appearance for the club if he's playing Kuhn, Maeda. Winger's very important to the style of play under Rodgers. Who do you think will start, and how do you think will have the biggest impact?
I think if he's fit, and that's a big if because he's reported to have some back issues, but I think if Kuhn is fit and up for starting, I think he'll get selected. And this is the paradox of this matchup, which is the irony is that with the loss of O'Reilly and Bernardo basically subbing in for him, and with Kuhn and Maeda as the two wingers, Kyogo as well, but he's less of and I don't mean this puritanically the way it's going to sound, but one-dimensional players, meaning that Kuhn and Maeda in an attacking sense, like they're getting in behind is like a huge part of where they bring value. So it's almost the irony and the paradox here is that we're the counterattacking team. Like if we go with that selection, if they do try to press us and play a high defensive line, like bring it on. Like I think we should welcome that because with those three players in the forward line, and with McGregor and Alistair Johnson showing the ability to do it, obviously Hatate from deep being able to create and hit those guys with runners in behind and diagonals. I mean, to me that could be, and Butland's no great shakes off the line, so that could be a winning formula. Which speaks to the conversation that we had with Patrick, which is if I'm Rangers, I don't do that. Like that's insane to me. To high press with, and I think from what I've seen, I'll butcher his name, Cerny. I don't know. He's got those weird things above his name that the Eastern European guys have. I don't know how to deal with those. I barely can handle tildes and umlauts.
They're all your ancestors, by the way, James.
I know. But yeah, so I think he's a good player. Like he's not an explosive player. He's kind of a crafty winger.
Yes.
But I think he's still getting up to fitness. He got a late start in his summer with them. A couple of people I know that actually pay attention to the continental and Eastern European leagues, have him in high regard. They were surprised that Rangers got him actually. But he's not a pressing machine. That's not his strength. And Lawrence is not a pressing machine. I mean, he's pretty bad off the ball. And to Alan's point with Patrick, Matando's a really athletic guy, but I'm not sure he's one that's like disciplined and well coordinated on his pressing triggers, that kind of thing. So I think they would be nuts to deploy that strategy. Doesn't mean they won't. All the dynamics we talked about with Patrick, that might be how he comes out and does it. But if they were to sit back and we've got Kuhn and Maeda as the wingers, that's I'm not sure how well they're going to create from wide if Steven Gerrard's narrow Christmas tree formation was lined up with the midfielders that they could play that we discussed with Patrick as well. The other thing I'll say that I think probably hasn't been discussed much, and it did manifest in one of their games already or earlier, was when I looked at their new center back signing that Patrick referenced. And it was kind of a smart way that they picked him up at a discount price, proper. I think he came from FC20, if memory serves.
Michael Bielka's replaced him.
Right. Yeah, the circle of life, right? He is a very, very, and I say I'm going to use three very, very reckless player. And it's in his data, like his willingness to take kind of crazy risks diving in bad locations, and his not only his foul rate but his card rate and concession of free
kicks. He'll be okay in Scotland though, won't he?
Well, you're right. So that's the dual-edged sword. I mean, so if you were going to recruit that kind of player, Rangers doing it domestically probably is the best venue for that to happen. But if he mistimes a tackle and goes in like really rough, and he's going to be facing three forwards that very likely could catch him off-footed or catch a run. I mean, wouldn't be surprising.
He's not, James, I'd be right in thinking he's not particularly tall and he's not particularly fast either, is he?
No, he's just very aggressive. I mean, I think he's like quick within 3 to 5 yards. And he's got that little burst because he's a, and I say this kind of affectionately. I like these kind of players, generally because they're little nuts. So, when you're playing sports and you act a little nuts, like that's always a fun thing to see. So he's a little nuts. And, but yeah, he's not, so that can turn horribly wrong in the wrong matchup. And I think we present those kind of challenges. Now, I think those challenges would be a lot bigger if we had O'Reilly instead of Bernardo creating off of the right. But, so that again compounds why I think they would be nuts to line up in kind of a front-footed high line press. But I've been high on Dessers pretty much the whole time. I think he's a dangerous weapon. I'm not calling him the greatest forward in the history of the world, but he's not someone I want having 3 to 5 chances falling to him in the box. Let's put it that way. Particularly if it's like 1v1 against Scales. That's not a matchup I want to be seeing in space. And like I said, Cherney's a weapon. Matando's fast. That's what I'll say. And, that he can create problems in transition because of that. So yeah, I'm always nervous going into these games, and I always probably overcompensate for that and expecting more out of Rangers than they're going to give. But it's one of those things where, again, I see a formula where they could really give us a pain in the ass in this game. I doubt they're going to play that formula. So I'm very confident going in, but I still have that kind of irrational fear of, maybe one of their managers is finally going to come up with a good game plan against us, because we've been going so long now where they don't.
So, James, it's 77 yellow cards and 5 red cards in his career.
Yeah, he's a nut job. It's crazy. Like
I think
when I looked at him,
disciplinary record here will be exemplary.
Well, but that's I couldn't believe, one of the things I do in my benchmarking is I do foul rate. Basically I take ratios of how many fouls per action they have, as because he's an active guy too. It's not, because he's like I said, he's aggressive. So normally guys that are aggressive and have a high volume of defensive engagements will have a higher foul rate. So that's why I normalize it per engagement. And he's off the charts even then. Like it's crazy. And then you throw in the cards. It's wild.
Well, he's actually he's one of these. He's actually in the image of his manager. I mean, that's what Philippe Clement. He was exactly that kind of player as a player.
Yeah, intense. Yeah, so that can cut 2 ways, right? So if he has a day where his timing's on and the ref shockingly is a little permissive, which who could ever see that happening from John Beaton, right? So there is a recipe here if they could beat us up a little bit, because even with that front 3, I mean, they're not big physical guys, and if they get banged around a little bit.
But I mean, but James, again, this is we talked about this in the past, but do you really think Diamonde, Barron, Lawrence, Czerny, and Matondo are going to beat anybody up, right? I mean, that's a real physical. That's a relatively weak team physically as well.
Yeah, I think Diamonde is a willing physical player. Like he's lanky, strong. I call it. He's not a big, heavy guy or muscular, but he's got that lanky strength. And he's
pretty rash.
He's been dirty. Yeah, he's been dirty a little bit too.
He's very rash.
Yeah. So and again, I should check my language there. It's always a fine line between dirty and aggressive. So I probably shouldn't call him dirty, but he's had some pretty. Rugged. Yeah, full-hearted. Yeah, he's had some pretty some forearm type action and some tackles, that kind of thing. So he's roughed up Hatate in the past. So that's the kind of thing I worry about, is that we get in these kind of 1v1 situations where some of our guys can get beat up given the refereeing standard that we're going to very likely face.
I think McGregor's a worry in that sense. He's kind of been the metronome for us in so many ways, and they know that. If they go in heavily on him, we're talking potential injuries and that side of things. That's a concern. But for me, worryingly, because you've seen it all before, I feel pretty relaxed going into this with that nagging thing in the back of my mind, saying, "Oh, who knows what happens, player gets sent off, dodgy decision, etc." On a purely footballing level, we should be winning, and we should be winning comfortably. There was part of me also considering that rope-a-dope idea of let let them come on to us and with the speed that we've got hit them. But I think that'll be totally alien to Rodgers. It'll be possession, possession, pressing, 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 and I think we'll dominate them. I really do, and I think we're good enough to win fairly comfortably, all things being even.
And I mean, even in the three games so far, and bear in mind one of their games was one of those freakish blowouts where Ross County were just like played like a school team
Unbelievable.
basically.
Hmm.
It was just astonishing. But even with all that and the fact probably Celtic have had if you look at it based on last year's results, probably the tougher of the three games. Celtic complete about 200 more passes, 200 more passes per game. So in terms of level of directness versus possession, that's huge. The one thing. The one thing that they have had is they're running an incredibly high XG per shot, which is one of the more insightful metrics that there is really. So I think 0.16 XG per shot. That's very high. But again, if you look at the Ross County game, I think four of their goals were within the 6 yard box. So again, it's been kind of padded out by that. But Celtic are forcing the opposition goalkeeper into more saves. Our post shot XG is about is zero point 0.5 higher. Um, we're creating at least one big chance more than them every game. We're conceding less than half the shots they are. We're conceding about half our goalkeepers having to make half the saves that Butland is. We're allowing about half the shots in the box that they are. We've got a post shot xG against of 0.06 and an average xG per shot against of 0.04. And I think it's that defensive solidity which they don't have because they've had a lot of change in that department and Hefty, from what I've seen of him, is actually an exciting player going forward. But he leaves a lot of space at the back, and he's another one he likes a rash tackle as well. So I just think defensively, I'm feeling that we're quite strong. I'm not feeling
Hmm.
that we always talk about free kicks, corners in these games.
Hmm.
The Rangers have had a sort of athleticism, yeah, benefit against us in recent years, but I don't even see that this time. I honestly don't even see that really. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm being a bit bullish, and I'll definitely be nervous on the day. But in all honesty, Celtic should be looking at a comfortable win, and I think a statement win. I don't mean
Yes.
6-0 or anything. I just mean a really one-sided game with a couple of goals, maybe. I just think that's that. If they've then the transfer window's closed, they've not really bought anyone in. I just think for the rest of the season, that's a real psychological blow because I think after that game, do we have 2 weeks international break? Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. International
So,
break, first one. Yeah.
so that 2 weeks of stewing or on our side being quite content, that's very important psychologically, I think.
Yes.
Well, Martin, so what you had talked about relative to McGregor speaks to the insanity of them going 4-2-3-1 with Lawrence as the 10.
Yeah.
The idea that he's going to be the one that's going to man mark or try to McGregor,
Yeah.
or if they go, which they have done this, kind of the standard 4-4-2 defensive shape. One of those top two, along with Desters, has to be either Cerny or Matondo, which we just talked about. And usually what teams will do is the opposite off ball guy will drop in to cover McGregor, man mark
Hmm.
McGregor,
Yep.
and then they
Yep.
swap them off, So neither one of them is well equipped for that. So, bring that on is what I would say.
Yep.
But again, where I'm again try to um, stress test, steel man our confidence, because I think you'd have to be nuts not to be confident going into this game, given all of the context, is because they have started to do more of this kind of central vertical passing. It's not to the extreme level of a Red Bull,
Hmm.
but it's, Red Bull adjacent, I'd call it. Is that's not something that we've been tested with at all this season. So, we have all these great patterns of play. And this is, we talked about how we've almost been moving towards Ange ball relative to the patterns of play and the rotations and the overloads and all that stuff. And the one thing that does leave you open to a little bit is if, Hatate's way over on the right with
Yep.
Bernardo in an exchange, and all of a sudden you've got a transition opportunity because of a misplaced pass. They've at least got the athletes and the skill level and now I think the difference is they've got Barron is competent at doing that. I'm
Hmm.
not saying he's a world beater. He's not Pirlo, but he's not John freaking Lidstrom. So it wasn't a high hurdle to get over. So when the ball drops to Barron, he can carry it a little bit and make one of those line splitting passes. Diomande is the same way. So they have both the ability to do it, not expert by any means, but also the willingness to do it. So it's those transition phases that I don't think we've been, really stress test much at all, other than a little bit against, Man City and Chelsea, which,
So I mean,
we did concede a few goals in those games.
So with Ange Ball, with the inverted fullbacks and the rest defence with McGregor, you had a 2 and a 3, you had a 5 rest defence, sort of like a little wedge there in the centre of the park. So you're highly exposed on the wings, but your centre was relatively safe. We're not obviously seeing that inversion to such a high degree under Rodgers, which does leave potentially, like as you said, James, because we know that, especially Hatate tends to be, he will drift quite wide and he won't necessarily recover quickly to protect that space in front of his centre back and his full back. So we are, I think, maybe at risk from that. And yeah, if it's a ball from their left to their right, i.e. our left diagonal to Sherney on the break, that to me would be the big concern.
And they've been playing that ball a lot to Cherney. Long diagonal reversals, and so that to me is one of the issues, is that we both want and should want Hatate to become more of the freelance attacking midfielder now, because we're not going to get that out of Bernardo, and so we're almost overly reliant now on Hatate in that regard, which means you want to unleash him, you want to let him kind of be the virtuoso, but with that comes that risk that as he's playing his jazz music.
So I mean, out of possession, we still do the same as what Ange did. We fall back to a 4-4-2. Now you don't see it very often in Scotland, but essentially out of possession, because we're not out of possession for more than a few seconds, and if we are, we're even anywhere from the halfway line on, we're defending a long throw into our box. So you very rarely see Celtic's out of possession shape, which is going to be a 4-4-2, and the 2 is Kyogo and Hatate. And that's really wise to me. That makes absolute sense, right? Because it's not Hatate's strength to be covering his centre back. So Ange made the mistake. Well, it wasn't a mistake. It was wise. He had O'Reilly up next to Kyogo, because O'Reilly was Celtic's best presser. But O'Reilly was wasted. Then O'Reilly's, I think, better protecting McGregor, because his anticipation's good, his positional sense is good. He reads the game well. So that to me, I think Bernardo and McGregor sitting, if you like, out of possession, and then Hatate and Kyogo being that initial person. I think if we fall into that quickly, that's fine. But I just think we'll have quite an overwhelming amount of possession, and I think that diagonal, that's the one thing I'm worried about, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can.
This is a marathon episode. I mean, the whole goal of this recharge is to make these Thursday show more of a free for all, with the Tuesday show more of the tighter one. So we've lived up to that expectation in the first go here. So hopefully everyone enjoys this new experimentation and format for Thursday. We're still trying to work all this stuff out, but new things are in the works. So stick with us. And Martin, you want to take us out? Here I am stepping on your toes. You're the man.
Yeah, I can see that aggression that you alluded to earlier, and why you like those sort of footballers there, the way you just went in right over the top and put me out the game.
Watch out, Martin.
But I admire that.
I'm gunning for you.
Yeah, let's show me a good loser, I'll show you a loser. No, in all honesty, thanks again, guys. I thought it was really insightful. I loved, the point Alan was making there just at the end as well, about the defensive shape that we never see, which is very true. I thought that was absolutely terrific. But yeah, we've covered a lot of ground there. As you say, we're finding our way very much with this. I hope everyone has enjoyed it, and we look forward to some more really interesting debates using the data analysis. And thanks, Alan, for your points of view. James, as ever, thank you so much, and we look forward, hopefully, to, for you to listen in future or watch us on YouTube. Thank you.